everybody. Thank you for joining the Baobab Project. I'm here with David Baum, who is a professor and a former chair of the botany department and a fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'll say they're on par with UNL, but it's definitely an awesome institution. I would say it's way above UNL, but we got a shout out for the people that are from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I'm from. We are Big 12 rivals. So he conducts research in evolutionary biology, plant genetics, and the origin and early evolution of life. That's a mouthful. We're going to dive into some things that, again, I have no idea about, but I had to have him on because he is a specialist in, we're going to get into that set, but a lot to do with plant evolution and then the baobab fruit and the baobab tree itself. So a little background on David, and before I let him introduce himself. So he obtained his undergraduate degree in botany from Oxford. Again, just amazing institutions. Evolutionary, so where he got his PhD in population evolutionary biology from Washington University, and then conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Wisconsin. He's, I don't know how to describe this, but insanely well published. So we'll start off with why it's important, and how I found him was he actually wrote a dissertation on the pollination and floral biology. Actually, David, can you help me at this point before you introduce yourself? I never can say it right, but how to say the genetic term for the baobab? Adansonia. Is that correct?
Adansonia, yeah. Named after a guy called Adanson.
Adansonia. Oh, that would make a lot more sense. So, so that is how I originally came across David, as well as just starting to research more about the baobab tree in general. And so the last bit is I just kind of want to go into your publishing background, because in this space it's huge. So you've published 2 books. You have over 120 research publications. You have too many awards for me to go through. But I think this is fascinating. I know I joked about this with you before, but you also teach introductory biology, which I feel like kids are underpaying for your expertise. So, but where we're really going to stick is with the baobab tree and evolution here. So David, I think I kind of touched on most of the things. If you want to introduce yourself in any other way, I want to give that kind of broad background.
I mean, I guess the only thing I would just clarify is, I'm an evolutionary biologist. So that's really what connects everything for me. I happen to have started my career and spent a lot of my career studying baobab trees. But for me, baobab trees, to any kind of plant, animals, fungi, it doesn't matter. Everything is interesting because it's products of evolution. So that's really my central organizing theme, I guess. And what I teach the students.
Yeah, so I know this is a low term, and I kind of want to start with that because your research now, or most of your research has been on, like you said, plant evolution. And just understanding the origin of life. And so for me, it's a loaded term. So I guess let's start from the beginning. You were interested in evolution before plant biology, or were you interested in plant biology before evolution? How did those come about to have you start studying what you study?
I guess about the same time. I mean, I loved evolution. I loved natural history. And then I discovered botany actually when I was in high school. So, and realized that plants were just cool. I love plants. I love flowers. I love knowing, what's in my world. So I decided I want to go to college to study botany, but always it was really about, how the diversity of plants arose through evolution. And I really aspired to, get down and study plants in exotic places. So I really was passionate about trying to get opportunities to do research in the tropics and study, cool, weird plants and their evolution. So I just kind of from there, the rest happened somehow.
Yeah, well, I think that's the crazy part now, because we talked about this before when I was just talking to you about even coming on here. So you now, it's more of the origin of life. You're completely focused on the origin of life, but like how does that transition? How does the plant, for me, like somebody that doesn't, I mean, obviously most people have a basic understanding of evolution. How does studying the plants help us better understand the evolution of everything? I guess would be my first question.
Well, so, I mean, in order to study evolution, we study lots of different organisms because, ultimately what we want to explain is, the millions of different species on the planet and why they each have their particular characteristics. And to do that, we have to study the characteristics in different groups and understand the principles that allow flowers, let's say, to evolve and to evolve in such a way that they fit the pollinators of those particular species. And then ask questions, well, how do pollination systems change? How is it that a lineage at one point in time can be pollinated by bees and then switch to being pollinated by bats or something? So, so that's generally what evolutionary biologists do, is we study the principles of that underlie evolution in general, and then apply it to particular kinds of traits that we're interested in. And so I've done that over time with different kinds of traits, botanical traits like flowers, and uh, the, the, the architecture of the plant, like how plants organize their shoot systems. But and then I'm just using the same principles now to really understand what how evolution got started, which is it's more theoretical, more chemical, but to me it's extension of the same basic understanding. How does evolution work? You can't now I want to know, well, how did evolution begin working?
Sorry, no, that's why I have this question, because I'm like, how does evolution even begin? Like, it makes sense now. It seems like plants, you can gather a lot more information a lot quicker, correct? Because, well, maybe not quicker, but like the evolution of moving from a bee to a bat could probably happen pretty quickly, or maybe not, but at least that gives you a timetable that seems scalable to work with. Whereas a lot of things happen over extremely long periods of time. You're not checking the evolution of an animal the same way. But then, how do you even start? Where did you like? Did that understanding help you figure out even where to start? I guess when you start thinking about the theoretical idea of where evolution
And I
began.
don't think it's direct. I don't think that the work I've done in plants directly informs my work on the origin of life. Because I developed an understanding of evolution and evolutionary theory, and come to the realization that if in order to understand the origin of life, we have to understand evolution well enough to understand how evolution got started. And so I guess I believe that we have new ways to think about that problem that make it tractable. Not tractable in the sense of we can travel through time and observe the actual origin of life on this planet, but that we can understand the chemical principle that would allow chemical systems like chemistry in the environment, when there's no life, to start showing dynamics changes that look like evolution, and start accumulating complex features that we associate with life. So that's what we try and do now in my lab. But I got my beginnings just sitting in trees studying flowers, and that's just the way scientific careers work. Sometimes you start doing one thing and you end up doing something very different.
I was, if it makes you feel any better, I think that's how
Yeah, that's
most
true.
careers are. You start out with one thing and then it spurs something else. But especially in this space, right? Because it's just endless. Um, like in the amount of things that you could potentially do, and you can either stay, say, with just plants or whatever. And in your case, you chose the evolution component, and then that changes everything else that you do. So, okay, that leads me to my first question. Which makes sense. So you were trying to look at more exotic trees in general, correct? And so that leads me to my question: why the baobab tree? What makes it so special? I guess would be my first question, because I have you here around the baobab tree specifically, but I'm also just super interested in everything that you're doing.
Well, I mean, baobabs are just super, super cool trees. But the reason personally got involved was, a little bit of, there's some particular history. So when I was an undergraduate, I mentioned I was really excited about the possibility of finding ways to work in the tropics. And so at the end of my second year as an undergraduate, I managed to go with a group of other students to Madagascar to do some research. And it wasn't on baobabs, but I went to Madagascar, and it was an experience. Um, and it led me to think about the plants that were in Madagascar. And I had this particular interest in pollination and floral biology. And I just found out that there is this group of trees called the baobab trees. There's one really well-known species that is widespread across continental Africa, but there were multiple species in Madagascar, not just this one, and they had very diverse flowers, And people had speculated that some of the flowers might have some really interesting pollination systems. Maybe they were pollinated by lemurs, which are primates. And so I was intrigued, and I figured, well, that would make a great PhD project to try and study the pollination biology of all the species of baobab and make sense of it. And so I started kind of pitching it to people, and it took the funding situation was tricky in the UK at the time, and I ended up finding an opportunity to pursue that based at the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis. So that's how I got into baobabs. But once I was studying baobabs, they're the kind of, people call them charismatic flora, charismatic megaflora, because they're these just amazing trees that tend to dominate their landscapes. They're so distinctive looking and so large and provide so many resources that they play an oversized role in local cultures, in ecotourism, in the ecology of the actual forests that they often dominate. So they are really, in those environments, they're really special trees. Of course, there are lots of other special trees in the world, but I fall in love with baobabs, and I spent my whole career now learning more and more about them.
Okay, that makes sense how you got to Madagascar. And for people that don't know, and I think I guess you could explain it, but really the majestic looking baobab tree, which now I know is fruited or has a different pollination system than the I wouldn't say it's a generic one, but the one that like you said is throughout the continent of Africa is completely different. So the one in Madagascar is the tallest, taller, skinny one. It's very like photogenic. It's been photoed everywhere. Whereas the one in throughout continental Africa is more of the, I call it the upside down tree, or like the fat bottom tree. It's very distinct in its own right. So do you can you explain a little bit of just the differences, and then how they got there? And I assume the flowers probably helped you understand why they're different, correct?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's lots. So let me just first of all give you a quick sort of rundown of the diversity. So the genus is this Adansonia, named after this French botanist Michel Adanson, who first described it in the 18th century. And he described the African baobab, which is a species that's found from all across West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. They're quite variable. They can actually be quite tall and elegant, or they can be, short. They can be absolutely huge. I mean, they can be ginormous. Very long-lived trees. They produce a fruit that was travels very well. So it was known in Europe before the tree was known. There we go. Great, exactly.
I always bring this when people are in person so they can hear it and do it, because it's a crazy, like you said, travels well.
Yeah.
It's powder inside.
So that was well known. And then what was he? Was to get the order right? Then, well, basically, more or less in parallel, there were the British explorers in northern Australia found a tree, a weird tree. Big. They called it the gouty stem tree initially. Weird name because it had this big fat trunk. And the botanists initially thought maybe it was related to a caper, but it turns out that they looked at it more closely and realized, no, it's a baobab. So there's a species of baobab of Adansonia that was in northwestern Australia, and that's called Adansonia gregorii. The Gregory expedition was one of the first expeditions there to discover and characterize this tree. And in fact, you can find the trees that uh, they did graffiti on actually still there. So the Gregory expedition left a physical mark on the trees that they discovered. Um, and then independent of that, the French explorers, and earlier than that, actually, a Portuguese explorer had mentioned these trees in Madagascar. But in Madagascar, it was confusing because there seemed to be lots of different species. Not so there's one in Africa, one in Australia, and then it became a little bit confusing. How many were there in Madagascar? And through some work of some French botanists, when I started my PhD, people thought there were 7 species in Madagascar. I ended up concluding that one of them didn't exist, so there are actually 6 in Madagascar, and they vary greatly. So there are these ones that you mentioned that are quite tall and elegant. Other ones can be incredibly squat and short in dry areas and very, very fat. In fact, individual species can, in some areas, be very short and fat, and in other areas, be tall and thin. And then what really attracted me to them was that within Madagascar, the flowers were very different. from the different species. And all I ever saw initially was drawings and dried herbarium specimens. You didn't get a sense of color really, although colors were mentioned, but you got like this. Well, there were some that were kind of ball-like flowers or cup-like flowers that maybe like this, and then there were some really long ones, and they were different from the Australian and the African species as well. And so there is this broad diversity of baobabs in these three areas. And so there are lots of interesting questions. How did they get to those three areas? Why do their flowers so different? What about each species flower allows that species to reproduce? So those are the kind of questions that I sort of addressed in my PhD work and thereafter.
So I think my first question out of this, one, I want to get a little bit more into the Madagascar and the PhD portion, but a couple questions that I need to broach right away because I don't know the answers to. So from an evolutionary standpoint, how is it in Africa and in Australia? Do you have any idea yet? Or does anybody know? Like, that seems crazy.
There are lots of theories. And when I started, one of the prominent theories was it was known that Africa, Madagascar, and Australia were all parts of this giant continent, the southern continent called Gondwana, which fragmented about 120 million years ago. But my work basically established there's no way that the baobabs are old enough to have actually been present 120 million years ago. They're much, much younger than that. So that's not how they came to be there. So we know that they had to travel across the Indian Ocean somehow. Now, it's not hard to get between Madagascar and continental Africa. They're a few hundred miles apart, and those fruit float pretty well. But how it ended up in Australia is an issue of debate. Now, my personal belief is that the migration was from Madagascar / Africa to Australia relatively recently, meaning within the last 20 million years, after Australia entered the tropics, because Australia spent a long time in the south, in the southern hemisphere, in the temperate region, which is not good for baobabs. It got into the tropics. That's my personal belief, is that it got there either direct flotation from, say, Madagascar, or maybe there were some extinct populations that used to be in places like India that served as stepping stones for the baobabs to get to Australia. We don't know. That's my own belief. There are other people who've floated the possibility, well, maybe actually the migration went the other way. So what I haven't told you is the closest living relatives of the baobabs are not in Africa or Australia. They're in South America. So at some point it had to get...
What?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, now I know why you study what you study, because you're like, oh, we figured this out. No, we didn't. It's on a whole other continent, so we got to go over there and try to figure out what happened.
So I mean, so at some point they had to get over from South America, and we know that a lot of plants, and because evolutionary time is long, things move around, and we have a hard time mentally conceptualizing that. It's worth remembering that whatever 30, 40 million years ago, there were rainforests in New Jersey. So, and there's evidence that a lot of plants actually, during that much warmer period, when there was tropical forest in what is now temperate, or subtropical forest in what is now temperate North America, temperate Europe, a lot of plants seem to have actually traveled from the tropics through North America into Europe and then down into Africa. That's one route that's discussed.
So what's the closest relative? What is that closest relative?
It's a group of tropical trees from South America. I mean, the names probably won't mean anything. Yeah, Catastema and...
No. But there's just a group of like tropical...
Yeah, the family, or well, what used to be a family, we've now treated it as a subfamily that the baobab is part of. It's called the Bombacoideae. Good name. And it includes and so almost all of them are in the Americas. There are 3 genera that are in the old world, Africa, Asia. Adansonii is one of them, and one of them is Bombax, and one of them is another group called Rhodonaphalon. But apart from those, they're all south in the Americas.
Do they look similar at all? Do the ones in South America?
quite a lot of them have, yeah,
Because there's one in South America that's called like the bottleneck tree or something like that, right? In South America.
bottle trees. There are quite a few bottle tree types in this group, meaning they have sort of relatively fat trunks that often come taper at the top,
Yeah, yeah.
and a few of them in this group in the Bombacoides. Yeah, I was just in Costa Rica this week and just got back, and down there there's a few several species in this group. One of them that I just happened to see in flower has flowers that are very similar to some of the flowers, superficially similar to some of the flowers
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
of the really long flowers I mentioned in Madagascar, and they happen to be flowering. It's kind of cool to see.
I'm starting to understand why you like this.
Yeah, no, I mean they are cool trees, and in the big picture, so the Bombacoides, just to contextualize it, it's very closely related to the group that includes cotton and okra, and so that's hibiscus, and also in that big group, there's also things like chocolate, balsa wood, um, yeah, cola nut. So there's quite a few interesting sort of mainly tropical plants in that group.
It's interesting though how we consume them because they're all roughly in weird ways similar, but not the actual fruit parts. And we can get into that in a little bit. But like the fruits are different, but they all kind of have weirdly similar traits in some way. Um, like I said, and that I do want to get into fruit. I don't think that's where I wanted to go yet. I still want to try to understand some more about the age of the tree and stuff like that. So, um, like you said, they're not 120 million years old. They grow a really long time. They can live for a very long time. Do they live longer than most other types of trees? And then how old are they? Yeah.
They definitely can live, a couple of thousand years, and that's known because people have studied using carbon dating methods. Now, they're tricky. It's tricky to do that because in order to really do a carbon date, you kind of have to get wood from the middle of a tree. The oldest part of a tree is usually in the middle, and they're really big trees, and so it's not easy to do that. And then a complication is that baobabs are particularly good at regenerating wood tissue. So if they get hollowed out, the so the part of the tree that grows out is actually just below the bark, and the middle of the tree is dead cells, so it can't actually regenerate. But baobabs seem able to kind of spread that bark tissue into a hollow, and then start filling in the hollow on the inside. And so that complicates life because then you have younger wood sitting inside older wood, which is atypical. So it's tricky. But the data pretty convincingly show that they're at least, some of them can be at least 2,000 years old and maybe 3,000 years old.
One of our suppliers, he's the African plant hunter. He loves doing all this stuff, and he's got a lot of great information. But so he talks about the outside bark. But I'm going to go into this question because they have the hollowed out tree. So you have the center portion is the old dead cell. Like this is the center. How big? Like say it's a super wide tree. Would it just be a small portion, like percent wise? Is that kind of main tissue that would be dead, and then everything out from there can be regenerated, or is it pretty large? That's a dead tissue.
Yeah, the living tissue is really thin, and it's out near the outside of the tree, just below the bark.
Got it. Got it.
So that there's a special layer. It is true for all trees. This is how trees get wider. They have this layer that makes bark on the outside and new wood on the inside, and it just keeps getting pushed out. And the wood it makes dies, and so it's just kind of gradually having to move out as and leaving behind new wood on the inside. So yeah, so that's true of all trees. That's why most trees, if you go around and you can kill a tree by girdling it. If you go around a tree and you just scrape off the bark in a ring, that tree will die because it has no way to get to make to transport material up and down anymore, and the wood you can't, yeah, it will kill the tree. Baobabs are relatively resistant to this because they seem pretty good at being able to regrow that tissue laterally and sort of fill in gaps somehow, although no one knows how, and I think it'd be great to study.
That's what I was going to ask because there's people that use the bark for rope, correct? Or they'll pull off the bark and like make mats and ropes and things like that. and then it grows itself back. So explain, because I had heard it's a succulent, which is different than is it? I'm just gonna say that. Is it a succulent? Is a tree different than a succulent in this case, or is it in a family that's closer? Like you said, it doesn't sound like it's anything towards a cactus. So
Yeah, I mean, succulent is a fairly kind of informal term, I guess. So they do have, so, so they, they are pretty fat. They have pretty high moisture content, and their strategy for dealing with drought is basically, when it rains, they take a lot of water in. They don't have super deep roots or anything like that, so they can't access water when it gets really dry. They just sort of shut down shop when it gets really dry, but they have a lot of water inside, so they can survive a long time. And actually, baobab trees can shrink, and if in long droughts, they will shrink a little bit, because of the moisture that they lose from their trunks. But they're basically they're still trees in the sense that they have a woody trunk that keeps growing. They just are relatively moisture rich, and their wood is not very dense. It's moist, and they have very fibrous bark. So that's why they make good ropes. And that's true actually for quite a lot of members of this group, that they have a lot of fiber.
okay, that makes a lot more sense. I'm starting to gather that. Have you seen huge differences? Okay, this goes into a little bit of the flowering, a little bit to the different species. Is there huge differences in the way that I mean, obviously the Madagascar trees grow taller sometimes and they grow fat. Like, what is causing the change in the types of growth? I mean, is the composition super different in the trees, or is it really similar and it's just something with the landscape, the water, like that they're so different?
Well, like most things, it's going to be a combination. I mean, so there's some degree of genetic difference, and so the different species have to some extent, you can tell apart from the way they grow. So two of the species in Madagascar, for example, have these very kind of flat branches. You can kind of see them in the landscape. They look like candelabras, and and that's clearly genetic. That's not the environment, because they can be growing next to a species, a member of another species, where the branches are kind of more like angled up, and spreading out. So some of it is individual differences that have evolved for whatever, and I don't know I don't can't give the actual mechanism. But then you take any one of those genotypes, those genetic types, and you put them in different environments, they're going to respond to that environment by taking a different form. So if they're in a very harsh environment, then without much competition, they will end up probably short and squat. But if they're in a nice and relatively nice environment, but there are a lot of trees around them, they're going to grow tall. So their individual form will be influenced by their individual environment.
It seems like they grow in more types of environments than most trees. Is that true? Or are most trees adaptable to a lot of different environments? The reason I bring this up is because, like you said, some will grow, obviously, with more water, they're able to grow faster. I guess that was an assumption. It seems to be that if they have more water, they grow faster or they're able to do things quicker, which would make sense because you said they go dormant if they don't have the water because they got to store the water and hold it and then they got to use it. But they also are growing it. It seems to be similar areas, but also kind of different, like throughout Africa versus Madagascar.
Well, I mean, the one thing everywhere it grows is a very seasonal environment where there is a dry winter. So they drop their leaves, and during the period that they have no leaves, water is really kind of too much water is a problem for them. They tend to rot. So they only occur in parts of the world where there is a drier winter and a wetter summer period. Um, and that's pretty uniform. But they can tolerate within that, and they don't tolerate freezing. So, but within that, they're pretty tolerant in terms of the kinds of places they can be found, in terms of the moisture gradient and the kinds of rocks and soils that they'll live on. They're pretty broad.
Yeah, I just have noticed. I mean, like they're in these all these different landscapes. I didn't realize that that was so important. I didn't realize that it needed the wet. I mean, I knew it was used generally in a wet summer place and then a dry, but I didn't realize that was like the real differentiation for them. So then, when it comes to flowering and then fruiting, I want to jump into flowering and fruiting a little bit. because we obviously use the fruit. And now the whole, I guess, yeah, let's start there. So the are there different fruits in Madagascar, or is the fruit pretty similar to the African continent based baobab tree?
There are some differences, so but they're more of degree. So the basic fruit structure is the same. So they have exactly. So
Got
they
it.
have that outer part, which is kind of woody, but it can vary from being really thick and tough and hard to break open in some species. But there are some species, particularly the Australian one, where it's very thin and fragile. In fact, the Australian fruits, when they fall off the tree, they just shatter. Really, they kind of open up. And my explanation for that is in Australia, the main dispersal agents are kangaroos and wallabies, which aren't really very well equipped to break open a fruit, but they can pretty easily eat the seeds. And I found seeds in wallaby scat. Um, so it goes right through and can germinate. The In Madagascar, two of the species also have relatively soft fruit walls, but they're not as soft as the Australian one. They're reasonably easy to open. But then some of them, the African one and some of the other Malagasy ones, have these really tough fruit cases that really take a bit of work to get into, and they also help them float pretty well in the water. Um, so yeah, and in Madagascar, in general they're going to be dispersed by large animals that will eat them. They will, they're rewarded with the white powdery pulp of the fruit, but the seeds, which are like kidney beans, kind of can pass through intact. So it has to be a pretty large animal because the seeds are not that small. And one of the questions, well, what is the dispersal agent in Madagascar? Because really there aren't very many big animals there now, and we're actually pretty confident that the original dispersers are now extinct. There used to be these giant ground lemurs that would eat a lot of things, and they're not there anymore. They were driven extinct when humans arrived about 1,500 years ago. So, so Madagascar now, it's unclear what the main dispersers are, except for humans. But in Madagascar, in Africa, it's elephants, it's baboons, it's antelope that can eat them and pass the seeds intact.
So like a baboon would crack it open itself, like because baboons aren't super big, but like it would literally like
Yeah,
crack it on a rock, right? But elephant would just crush it.
seen it. That would be my assumption.
Isn't that funny? Do people ever catch the animals eating it? Like, have is there videos of people catching like the different animals eating it?
I'm not sure I've seen them either, but people talk a lot about having seen a lot of monkeys and elephants and eating the fruit. So I seen that too.
Like you said, it's from a transport ability, and I had read some of that in the history of it, like coming. I think it was on like the Silk Road or something, where the transport of it was pretty easy because it can last a long time, and it's generally lightweight, and the hard shell keeps it from and it's powder, so like it has all these unique traits, and it's also not a bad like natural taste. Like it's a like cocoa or cacao. It's like kind of bitter. It's a good taste on its own. It's not like the best taste ever, but I could imagine as an animal, you're like, oh, this is awesome. Like, especially when I'm eating like grass or whatever else. It's like let's jump on some like powdery fruit. Although I always wonder because it like sticks to your tongue and like kind of like it dries out your mouth. So it'd be funny to watch them eat it and see what happens. Like they probably like it. They suck on it like it's like a lollipop or something like that. So I was super interested in kind of that's why I wanted to ask who ate it, stuff like that. So flowering, evolution, and then regrowing of the tree to reflower and then to fruit. So can you explain that process so I have a better understanding of how long it takes? I had read that it's a lot of based on water, like where they actually grow. But I wanted to get your kind of input on it.
I mean, there is so you kind of have to think in terms of the timing is going to be coordinated in some sense with the seasonality. So at some point, the rain starts, the beginning of spring turning into summer, and that's sort of when the trees will leaf out. And so different species have different strategies. Um, Now, I haven't studied the African species all across Africa, so and you probably know more, in fact, about the timing of the African species. But in my experience, they will often have flowers in sort of in high summer, which might be, um, if you're south of the equator, well, in sometime a few couple of months after the wet rainy season starts, and then the fruit I think take quite a few months, but to mature, but then they can sit on the tree for a long time because they can do that. They're very durable. In Madagascar, the different species have divvied up the flowering season. So there are some that flower right away, as soon as almost before the leaves are fully out or simultaneously with leafing. There are some that wait till the middle of the summer. And then there are a couple that actually flower in the winter when there's no leaves on the tree at all. And so that's one of the big divisions. And yeah, so that also, yeah, the two winter flowering ones in Madagascar are the ones that have the really different flowers from the other four, um, and all have different pollination system.
What a great dissertation, by the way. You had to be there the whole year. What a great thing to study that you're like, I got to be here all year because something's flowering at different points throughout the year. What a great, you accidentally probably stumbled upon that one. That is fantastic. So, okay, so they have the different flowerings. Then generally when it's planted to be to flowering and then producing fruit, when how long does that generally take? Was it Madagascar? Because you studied the Madagascar one. So let's just go into those ones a little bit. I don't know if you have those numbers. And if you don't, it's fine. I'm interested in all the parts of the tree.
In terms of in terms of how long until they become mature enough to flower again, you're
Yep.
asking, or are you just
Yep.
asking?
Yeah.
I don't think we know exactly. It's very dependent on the growing conditions, but they certainly can flower. So there, I know some people in Australia who have cultivated all of the species in Australia in the same environment, which is a good environment for baobabs because there are baobabs there, and they all flower within 10 or 15 years, and certainly by 20 there's a good chance that they're going to have some flowers, but they're going to be pretty small trees and they're not going to make very many flowers. So that's the kind of time frame that I'm aware of. But it probably is very dependent on the environment that they're planted in and how conducive it is to rapid growth and establishment. And a lot of the species in nature having a very hard time actually being growing in the wild because there's lots of things that will eat them when they're little. I mean, I mentioned that they're related to okra, and other things. I mean, the leaves, as you know, are edible, so cattle will happily, eat the leaves, and then the plant's in trouble. So it is not easy for them to get established in the without help nowadays in many places.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that because it is unique in that way. Like, there's not a lot. I guess there's probably a lot of trees that just every part of it gets eaten. But it seems interesting that so much of it is edible, and that's where I think I always figured that's where they derive the tree of life from. Obviously, it's a unique and interesting looking tree, but also the idea that so many parts of it are used by communities or by animals in general, that it just had this unique property that I didn't feel like a lot of other trees have, but I guess a lot of trees probably do. Every part of it's generally edible.
Yeah, I mean, most depends. Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a few plants that might be similar. What's interesting about baobabs, that in many places they will dominate forests. So, and there aren't, unfortunately, as many of them left as there used to be. But when I started my field work, there were places in Madagascar where they were the dominant tree. So you walk into a forest, and it's baobabs are the big abundant trees. And there are many other species in between. In those kind of forests, baobabs are what we call keystone species, kind of like holding up the bridge or like a keystone at the top of the bridge, in the sense that they're providing resources for so many of the animals. You say the leaves and the fruit and the flowers, the nectar. They provide hollows for things to nest in. So they're clearly very ecologically very important species. But there are many other trees that play similar roles in other forests. But in a baobab forest, it's a baobab.
So what has happened? Explain Madagascar. What's kind of happened with the tree in Madagascar? Where those forests just gone? Were those cut down to try to plant? some sort of crop, or has it the climate? I mean, well, I guess it could be all sorts of things.
I mean, Madagascar is not in a good place in terms of the ecologically. So it's a very poor country, and the population has grown dramatically in the last 40 years since I first went, and it puts pressure on the land. So there's three main things I guess that are problematic. One is people clear forest to grow rice, and the soil doesn't really allow for more than a year or two of growth before you have to clear more forest. And so people move through clearing forest. Now they tend to leave the baobabs in place, but they take everything else out. And so you do have these places where you just see these baobabs sort of sitting in a denuded landscape.
It is weird. I've seen those photos. That's super weird.
And it's very, and then the soil washes away, and eventually the baobabs suffer, and they certainly can't regenerate. The second thing that happens is people collect wood for charcoal. Similarly, they tend to leave the baobab doesn't make good charcoal or cooking fuel, so they'll take all the other trees, and a similar thing will happen. And then the last thing is grazing, and in some areas, fire. People start fires to promote, to help the cattle, to clear land for the cattle. So that can also cause problems. So as a result of that, there are very few places left in Madagascar where you can see an intact baobab forest, and they're in some small protected areas. Whereas if you go to Australia, even though there's a lot of cattle ranching, there are acres. I mean, just large swathes of places where you can see baobabs in forest, which is great.
I had heard a lot of those reasons, and I just wanted to kind of confirm with you because that was a big thing for us when we started this. Um, from my perspective, I have a background, I wouldn't say extensive background, but in history, and I was privy to trying to understand environmental history. And a lot of times we choose to move to places strictly to change the environment to benefit us, which, I mean, over time has made sense, right? And so baobab was a unique opportunity, being a keystone species, which I hadn't really thought of it that way. But it is already growing wild. It can produce a lot of benefits that are already there, and it can help the entire ecosystem because desertification I know is big in most of the developing world. It just ends up these situations happen, and even in the developed world, this stuff happens. So it's interesting to hear those main reasons, and it seems to be continuous throughout. So like our goal, and I've been trying to figure out how we can help it, other than obviously promote the value of the baobab fruit and the baobab tree, because that way potentially more gets planted. But that's why I always ask, whatever we're doing now isn't going to help now. It's going to help in 20, 30, 40 years, which is really cool to think about. But it's hard because you don't get to see that instantaneous result. But that's why I'm so interested in how this tree can affect the entire environment. And it sounds like from what you've said is it makes sense. I mean, because they're choosing in other places like Kenya. Just had some articles come out where they're having to literally rip out the tree, maybe potentially move it or get rid of it because they just need a plant to be able to survive, right? They got to plant some sort of crop for a year, like you said, that's not going to do very well, or they're not making enough money off the tree to make it sustainable. And so, like, that's what we've been thinking about. Okay, we have to get to a certain level where we can prove that we can get enough fruit from the tree to help tons of people make sure that they stay sustainable, and then do the other part of planting enough trees at the same time. It seems like it's a difficult process no matter what, but to me, it seems worth it completely. So because of its amazing uses, but also just the differentiation of the tree itself. The thing is the most amazing tree, and the fact that you've been able to study it for that long. Like I said, I came across your your information ironically when I was actually looking into the baobab tree, the boab, because they call it boab in Australia. I was like, I didn't even realize that it was there. Like that's why I've been so intrigued by this. I didn't realize species could pass over continents so easily, and so it's just to me, I had to talk to you about all these differentiations and how it came to be because I need to know this to explain it to other people on its real value. So I guess I would let's go into a little bit more of the flowering and and then we're pretty much, I don't have too many more questions. So explain the flowering because I know this was your research. Why is the flowering important? Why is the differences in the flower important? Or is it based on the fact that, no, why is it important?
Well, I mean, for any plant, reproduce. Well, for any organism, reproduction is key. Yeah, I mean, you've got to leave offspring, you got to reproduce. So in the baobabs all have large flowers, and they're interesting because all of them have nocturnal flowers. So the flowers open at dusk, and in each of the species, I figured out they only are functional for one night. Sometimes the flower will stay on the tree for longer than one night. But it's just sitting there, letting the pollen tubes, which is I'll explain that in a minute. But it's just sitting there. It's not actually being pollinated. So that's kind of something they all share, but there are some really big differences. And so the first obvious difference is the shape of the flower. So the African baobab has flowers that hang down on like stems, make it be maybe this long, and the flower bud is like it's like a baseball. It's a ball-like thing, green, and what'll happen is it will start opening at dusk, and you can watch it open, and then the outer parts of the flower, the sepals spread out back, and then the 5 petals spread out, and then what you have is uh, the male parts of stamens like a form a little ball, and then sticking out in the middle you've got the female parts, the style and the stigma, and on behind the sepals make nectar, large amounts of nectar that sticks to the nectar to the sepals and to the backs of the petals. And then what happens is bats, the main pollinators in Africa are bats. So they come in, they lick up the nectar, which is the reward. In the process, they get covered in pollen. And then they go to another tree and it will touch the stigma and put pollen on the stigma. And then what's going to then start happening is the way plants do things is pollen germinates and grows a little tiny skinny tube. It's like one cell, but it grows down through the below the stigma where the pollen lands. There's a thing called the style. The pollen tube will grow down the style and find the eggs, which are in the inside, the bottom of the flower. But once the pollen's there, it doesn't really need much of the rest of the flower. It just needs the style to stay there long enough for the pollen tubes to make their growth. So the petals will, and the rest of the flower will fall off sometime in the first, day or so. And that's the African one. The other species are all a little different. The Australian one has flowers. If you imagine the bud, instead of looking like a baseball, it looks like maybe a cigar, like a green cigar, long, and it opens up again at dusk, and it tends to sit kind of upright, and there are 5 long white petals that kind of come out and fold back. And the most important pollinators are probably hawk moth. Again, bats visit. Any nectar that's left, I think the birds will come in the morning and take nectar feeding birds will also take leftover nectar from them and may occasionally pollinate. The African one is also occasionally visited by other animals like hawk moth, the big hovering moths, are actually becoming to be more important pollinators because bats are under threat in many parts of Africa. They get eaten for food and hunted. So the fruit bats that would be the pollinators are at low abundance, and so in practice, a lot of the pollination is now happening thanks to moth. Also, bush babies, which are kind of little primates, will pollinate them in some areas. And then in Madagascar, there are 6 species, and they can be grouped into 2 subgroups. So there are 2 species that flower in the middle of the winter when it's leafless. And they have flowers they also come from a ball-like bud. But instead of hanging down like the African one, they sit on top of the tips of the branches, and they open up and they make a big cup-like flower with lots of stamens spread out. And the main visitors, again, are bats and lemurs. So I saw a lot of little nocturnal lemurs visiting them very consistently every night, going from tree to tree. They, licking up the nectar.
Were they still one night as well, or
Yeah, they're
were
all
they
one night.
all
Every individual flower is only open one night. And they make a teaspoon of nectar or whatever each one, and that's enough to make it worth the while. Especially in the winter when there isn't much moisture around. This is great for the lemurs to go around and collect nectar from lots of flowers, and they get pollen all over them. Same thing, and allow for pollination. I should say that as far as we can tell, all of the baobabs require cross pollination. So you can't pollinate itself. So one tree, the flowers on one tree have to get pollen from another tree to successfully make seed.
What? They're usually pretty far apart.
Well, that's one of the.
Like, aren't they not next to each other?
It depends. So when I saw the lemurs moving around, yeah, they were close enough together that they could move. The moths are pretty good at flying. Fruit bats are very good at flying. So if there are bats around, they can move. They can move pollen miles. Um, but if it's lemurs or bush babies, they're probably pretty limited in how far they can move. Um, so those guys are pollinated by mammals, both lemurs and bats. Um, and then the other four have really long. They're like the Australian one. They look like a cigar, but they're really long. And those ones they're really cool. If you ever go to Madagascar, you have to go out at dusk, sit under a tree, and look for a long cigar-like thing, and wait and watch it, because soon after dusk they start opening, and they open so rapidly you can see the parts opening. It's like it looks like time lapse, but it isn't time lapse, which isn't very unplant like. Um, anyway, they open pretty rapidly, and they are interesting because they're not white. The other ones are all kind of white or creamish, but these ones have bright yellow, sometimes even red petals. And the inside of the sepals are also red, and the stamens, the male parts, are kind of cream or pale, sometimes a little reddish at the tips. But the style and stigma is dark red. And so these guys are pollinated mainly by these very impressive hawk moths that they have in Madagascar. So these are a hawk moth is like they're moths like butterflies, but then fly at night. But they're very good at hovering, and they have a very, very long proboscis that they keep curled up, but they can uncurl very rapidly. And these flowers can be, a foot long. So these guys have to have a very long proboscis that they can insert down into the nectar chamber at the base of the flower while hovering above the flower. But they do it, and they're amazing. They do it really. It's kind of always amazes me that if you scale it up, it's like, imagine walking into a room and in about a second and a half uncurling a proboscis, which from our height would be going, whatever, like 30 feet to the other side of the room, drink from a glass of water, curl it up without getting any knots in it, and flying off in about 2 seconds. So yes.
I mean, the fact that anything ever gets pollinated and grows, how does anything ever grow? This is like that's incredible to even think that it happens and then something happens afterward.
But I mean, any one flower will get a lot of multiple visits because there are a lot of these moths around, and it's their main source of food. So, and one moth visit is going to be, could have lots of pollen from another tree. Each of those pollen grains can grow down this long, long style, and it can take more than a day to do that. Find one of those, one of the ovules that will turn into the seeds. So yeah, that's how it works, and it's pretty cool. I feel very lucky to have time studying this in the field. It's
Seen it, right?
Yeah, I've seen it all, and you have to climb trees at night and sit there and watch flowers, and that's cool.
How long? Yeah, how long do you have to be there? Like, how long are you there for a month, like hoping for the night that it's coming, or you guess it pretty well? Like, do you guys have it down to a science, or because it's got to be temperature based, it's got to be all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, clarification. Each flower is open for one night, but the trees will flower for a period of time. Each night, a new batch of flowers will be there, and so with practice,
So they don't all flower the same night. It's all different nights.
it's different nights, um, but over some period of time, a few weeks, depending on the species, they're going to be flowers produced. So every night you go out and you have to figure out, well, which are the buds that we're going to open tonight, and you get good at recognizing those, because the buds grow very rapidly in the last day, so you can distinguish the ones that will open tonight from the ones that will open tomorrow night. And so you plan, okay, so there are those buds that are going to open tonight. So I'm going to sit here on this tree and do these experiments, or I'm going to, whatever I'm going to do. And so then go up at night and watch and connect nectar, and we do experiments too where we hand pollinate them, see what happens.
Oh, interesting. You're not scared of heights, obviously, because the Madagascar trees are super tall.
I get nervous once in a while, hanging on a rope, 25 meters up.
How do you even get up there? Do you guys do the whole Yeah, do
No,
you do the whole
yeah,
rope behind and climb up, or how do you guys get up there?
I mean, I had to figure this out, but and I almost killed myself the first time I did it. But basically, you the way I learned to do it was I would have a slingshot, and I would have a fishing reel with a weight, and I would shoot a fishing line over a branch high up. And these trees can be 30 meters tall. The lowest branches can be maybe 25 meters up.
Yeah, the lowest branch isn't even climbable. Like you're not even near it.
So you take a few goes. If finally you get a fishing line over a branch, and then you pull up, you find the weight on the other end, and you tie a piece of twine to it, and you wind in, and you pull the twine up the tree, and then you take the twine and you tie that to the end of a climbing rope, a caving rope, and you pull that over the tree, and you tie off one end and climb the other end using ascenders. Um, and then you get in the tree and you tie yourself to the tree, and you can move around and stuff. Um, so yeah, it took practice, and I was young then, so I was willing to do that.
Right, you probably loved it. Well, it's funny because I was thinking about that. I was like, most trees are probably pretty easy. I mean, I like climbing trees. I guess when I was younger, I liked climbing them. I don't really climb trees now. But I was like, I don't think climbing the baobab tree would be that fun, especially the ones in Madagascar. Because I was like, how do you even start climbing it? But that makes sense. That was your methodology. Throw a fishing line and go from there. Okay, I have one more that I really got to know, and I know you. This is not your area, so if you don't have the answer, you don't have to. But why is the fruit powder? Do you have any idea?
I can speculate that you know if you're in a dry environment and you can attract animals to eat your fruit without providing moisture, save the water for your own purpose, your own use. So it's not, and it's worth saying that the moisture level does vary. The two Malagasy species that are bat pollinated, mammal pollinated, which flower in the winter, if you haven't, you should go to Madagascar and check that. Those fruit are really good. They're really tasty. And they have a little moister.
But they're still a powder form, but they're like a moist powder, or is it actually moist?
And I wouldn't call it by powder. It's more spongy. It's not. They turn into powder when they've been out when they're older, but when they're fresh, they're more like kind of spongy, and it gradually dries out. But it's never wet. It's not like pulp, like I don't know.
Yeah, not like an
Uh,
orange, right? Like I think of an
yeah,
orange tree.
it's not like a so they're stingy with their moisture, but it's high, relatively nutritious, powder.
I think I'm going to use that. That is one thing I will take from you on that one. They're stingy with their moisture, so they can give you all the powder nutrients you need. Because that's pretty funny. It's like thinking about that. Yeah, because I was like, is there any other fruit that does this, or is there any other tree that does this with their fruit where it's highly dry?
That we eat, I can't think of any, but I'm sure there are that that are maybe not sought after by humans so much. I think it's just a combination of having that natural packet. They're great for transport, and it's good. It's good nutrition. Makes them and it's one that humans have taken to using. Generally, humans are attracted to the moister, pulpier fruits, I guess. So I can't think of other ones. It is worth the little thing. I don't know if you knew this, but the seeds in are actually edible and quite nice. They're just inside a very hard seed case. So the seeds are also often eaten. It isn't
Oh,
good for the tree, obviously, and they're very oil rich. In fact,
for
yeah. But like in Madagascar, you can go to the market and buy a baobab oil, which is coming from the seed.
yeah. I know the oil sold a lot from the seed. It's interesting too because the fiber in between that holds the powder is also now harvested and makes a tea. So we don't sell that yet, but we were eventually going to make a tea where we were going to kind of combine some hibiscus with it. It's not like a taste; it's almost like a hard fiber. And then I know that I think they use the actual shell now as kindling because it's almost like a charcoal. I mean, it's not charcoal because you got to burn it down, but they can use it for that. So that's what's been nice with us is in this process when you crack open the fruit, they're actually using the shell to then burn that. They use a seed, they're using the fruit, and then they figured out a way to use the fiber. The fiber is still not fully there, but I mean, like it's kind of like thinking about orange fiber, but like being wood. It's like imagine over time if the orange fiber became wood. So yeah, I wanted to ask you that because I didn't know, but that I figured you'd have, and you did. You had a an explanation that got us there. That makes a lot of sense. So that helps. Honestly, those are my questions. I can leave before I go. I mean, if you have anything else that you kind of wanted to touch on that intrigues you, we didn't go too far into evolution. Maybe we could do that another time because that part's going to blow my mind, and I don't know if I'm ready to take in the full body of understanding evolution. But if you did have anything else, I would love to hear it if you did.
I mean, I guess the only thing that I think has come up because we talked a little bit about the challenges in Madagascar, but I think it's it is just worth highlighting that all of the species, even the African species, maybe not the Australian one so much, but all of them are at risk, in their natural environments, and that anything we can do to, establish, that help protect them in their natural environment and their interactions with local species, and just have them be valued by the local communities, it would be great. I mean, I just came back from Costa Rica, which has done a great job of placing value on the natural environment through ecotourism. And I would personally love it if there were ways that those kind of initiatives could also play a role in getting there to be more intact baobab forests left in the world, because they are kind of pretty much a wonder of the natural world when you see them. So, but and it can't be done with sustainable harvesting at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're at is like, how do because we wanted to start with the sustainably harvest product, but I think where it's got to go is, like you said, more ecotourism, planting more, forest regeneration. And we've been trying to work with some people in the US, the tree planting companies that could potentially try to help us in that landscape to try to create initiatives to plant trees in the specific areas. But I think another one for me, the biggest one is trying to create value over a choice, right? The choice, how do you make an income in a specific area? And if you got to choose to knock something down. So I hadn't thought about the ecotourism one, which is really interesting because people love to go to Africa, but I don't think they go to Africa for to like if the passion that you have talking about a flowering of a tree, like to me makes sense now. Like I actually want to go and literally go climb the tree and hang out and watch this, because not only is it that you get to watch animals in their environment. I would be a little scared. I get at least them up, so I know the animals aren't like lions and tigers and bears, but it's such a cool experience, and you're in nature and you get to do all this. So I haven't thought about the whole idea because we wanted to go next year, potentially as our team, but also try to bring more people along and kind of go see the forest, and see what's happening. Because for us, like I said, the big push for us was, one, we knew who harvested it, so mainly like where Haruna, our co-founder, is from, is in Burkina Faso. So in those areas, the people that are selling it or utilizing the fruit or trying to make money off of it, and trying to make sure that they survive, are usually women, and then it's always in rural regions. And so I've been trying to think of like, how do you bring people out to do it? And so now that makes a lot of sense. I didn't know that Costa Rica was doing that. They're just trying to do that with the entire biology of the forest, correct? Like just all parts of it.
Yeah, yeah, they've realized that, yeah, and they obviously get a lot of value as well locally, just because it's a better environment to live in if you have intact vegetation around you, intact forest. But they get a lot of tourists, and they make enough money off that to sustain a pretty decent economy. Um, And it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, when I was just there, I mentioned I saw this close relative of the baobab, which has these very spectacular big flowers that I know also open at night in the same way, very rapidly. And I was suggesting to the local guide, you should take people out at night to see this because this is really cool. You know, as far as I know, nobody is doing that as part of the eco experience. But it seems like a natural thing to do to get it more focused, not just on, well, let's see the monkeys, but actually, see the flowers doing things, and doing what they do best, which is, achieving pollination. So that to me would be a nice.
Which is crazy if you think about it. They do it, they achieve pollination. It's like they just sit back and let you do the work, but they achieve it, right? And it's like, I think we're just so disconnected in general life from vegetation, from plants, from our food, right? From our food, really. Like most people have never been to a farm. You're not seeing most of the food being produced, grown, anything like that. And so I think one of the best ways to start, like from an ecotourism perspective, even thinking about that, is that the exotic things are more interesting. Like you don't want to watch a broccoli grow, right? But like watching watching a baobab tree flower is a completely different experience because the landscape's different. The same as going to the Amazon. I just finished a book on the Amazon exploration. Although my friend said that was the harshest climate he's like the harshest environment he's ever been to, which is true. But like, it's spectacular when you can go and appreciate specific portions of it. I think especially like really focus in and understand how this thing has survived thousands, 100,000 of years through certain mechanisms in a specific environment is pretty intriguing.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you again for jumping on. I know it was completely random, so just so everybody knows, I literally called you out of the blue. I said I just read about this. I'm going to Australia in the next couple of months, so for you to want to do this after one conversation has been amazing. I might be picking your brain eventually down the road, but in the time being, I'm going to take everything you've given me, present it to people, and then also try to look at what we can start to do to conserve as well. So, again, thank you for your time, David. I appreciate you coming on.
Welcome. Take care. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Talk to you soon.